weeks off. 1 week we took off for Thanksgiving. That was last week. Hope everybody had a great one. And week before that, we were out for the Drug Policy Alliance Reform Conference in Washington, D.C., which I wasn't able to attend, but we had a lot of MAPS representatives there and a lot of other folks from around the drug policy community there. So we decided to take that week off too. Tonight, I'm really excited for this session. Super grateful for Sita for joining us and for Ryan also for joining us. Ryan wasn't able to make the last session on Veterans Day, but fortunately had his schedule open tonight. So great to have you here, Ryan. What we're going to do is, well, actually, first I'm going to mention we had originally planned to have my friend and colleague Jane Straight here tonight also joining us. Jane Straight is also an expert in plant medicines and has sort of been part of the sort of founding movement to redistribute and to bring more awareness to plant medicines, help people grow them themselves. I met both Jane and Sita through the Women's Visionary Congress, which is an amazing annual event in Northern California that takes place. Jane wasn't able to join us tonight at the last minute due to a family emergency, unfortunately. So we're all just going to send her our best wishes and hope that everything works out for her. What we're going to do tonight is to first just give a little bit of an introduction to what the course is about, and then just hear a little bit from both Sita and Ryan about their experiences working with ayahuasca and their interest in plant medicines. And then we're going to launch into some of these questions that we have laid out on the course page and several others that I just wrote down in the 10 minutes before the session started, just because there's so much here to talk about. And then we'll have half an hour or so of Q&A at the end. That's arguably the most fun because it enables all of you participants to just ask what you're asking that we may not have thought of before. So thanks to all of the participants, especially for joining us and signing up for this great course with Evolver. It's a pleasure for us to do it as MAPS and also as an opportunity to bring together all of these experts from all these various fields. So thanks so much. Portion of the proceeds from this are going directly to support psychedelic research. So we're all helping the field. Yeah. All right. Well, I'll just start by saying there's a lot of psychedelic research happening right now. There's a lot of interest in the mainstream uses of psychedelics for all sorts of purposes, healing, spirituality, personal growth. The focus of this course is on spirituality, so we want to kind of keep the conversation as focused as possible on the uses of spiritual experiences precipitated by psychedelics or involved with psychedelic experiences for these purposes. And ayahuasca, in my mind, is very comparable to LSD, not in any sort of pharmacological sense, but in rather a historical and a cultural sense. I think not since the emergence of LSD into the mainstream in the 1960s and 1970s, which was just an explosion of interest. Just over the course of a few years, people were using LSD recreationally. It became part of a whole political and cultural social movement. I think not since then have we really seen such a rapid expansion of interest in a psychedelic compound, or not really a compound, but a ayahuasca is really a mixture of plants. But not since then have we really seen such an explosion of interest, and a lot of the mainstream media interest and a lot of the public interest, major celebrities, politicians even, are starting to explore ayahuasca. So we're starting to see some of its roots and vines kind of wind themselves into our current cultural framework in a very, very fast way. So jumping right in, Sita, thank you again so much for joining us. You're in LA, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, great. I first got to know you, Sita, through the Women's Visionary Congress, through a talk that you did there, I believe, last year, on the ways to prepare for participation in ayahuasca ceremonies. I think that's a really, really important thing to be talking about right now. Retreat centers are all over the web. People are looking for ayahuasca ceremonies and healing for all sorts of reasons now. And so I think getting out the information, the really practical information about how to stay safe, how to have the most productive experience, what resources are available, would be just of that really essential importance for this course. So that's what I'm hoping that you'll be able to share with us. I also came to know you, Sita, through your work with Plant Teachers, really great educational organization, and then your recent Visionary Convergence in LA, which there were rave reviews. So I'd also love to hear a little bit about how that event went and your inspiration for that. So yeah, I guess we'll just start. Ryan, I'll be asking you a similar question. Sita, how did you first discover ayahuasca and plant medicines, and what was your initial impulse for seeking it out and learning about it?
Well, that goes back to 1998, actually. I actually first heard about it in 1996, which just seems like so long ago. It's 20 years ago. And it came to me through my yoga teacher, actually. And it's in my bio, but I had been sober from drugs and alcohol for 11 years at that point. And I was really drawn to this concept of using a substance. And I really had to check in with myself because of my sobriety. Like, was this an excuse to use? Or was I really drawn to it? When I first started, I had a lot of judgment about it, actually. But I sat with it for a year and thought, is this an authentic calling? And it just kept coming up and kept coming up. So, you know, the person who told me about it, I said, hey, I'm really interested if an opportunity presents itself. And it was another year before an opportunity presented itself. And it was the most terrifying night of my life. Like, just totally unprepared. All the things we're talking about, had no information about it. There was no Google. There was there was literally no Google. There's no way to get information except what this person told me. And I really went on the strength of that person's practice in life and what they stood for, and, you know, how they walked their particular path. And interestingly enough, that first ceremony was with an analog of, I think back on it, it's kind of crazy. DMT, Syrian rue, with 2.5 grams of mushroom tea on top of it.
Wow.
So it was, but what was really fascinating to me, the immediate transport, I found myself surrounded by plants in a jungle landscape that was completely unfamiliar to me. And that led to, ultimately, the upshot was, it was really terrifying. I came out the other side and felt like, in that moment, my life before ayahuasca and my life after ayahuasca began. So over time, you know, how I heard that this particular concoction comes from a brew in the jungle. And I'm like, there's a brew in the jungle? What? You know, I didn't know. And one thing led to another, and actually back then the Entheogen Review was still a print publication. Yeah. And so I started looking for all these things, and in the back was a tiny little ad for a retreat in Brazil with Luis Eduardo Luna.
Oh, excellent.
And it was happening like in a month, and I didn't have a visa, and I thought, I have to go. And I went. And that, you know, I continued to travel to Brazil, but for me, that connection with the plants just felt so right. And in a way, like I found like my spiritual center and my home in that landscape and in that cosmology. And the rest is kind of history. I followed the trail and met amazing people along the way. And then Jeremy Narby introduced me to a couple of shamans deep in Peru. And so I went to this remote location, and kind of the rest was history.
I imagine it's changed a lot since then, the environment. I haven't been to Peru myself, but you have. Has it shifted?
Yeah, a lot. When I first went, it was with an Ashaninka shaman who was still wildcrafting the ayahuasca vines, and I was the only white person there, and it was very interesting. I spoke zero Spanish and nobody spoke English, and I was like way out there. And but since then, you know, the proliferation of centers, the ayahuasca tourism, the number of people that know about ayahuasca, you know, just, you know, back then the only people, like I like my gateway was the city of Pucallpa, and pretty much the only white people that would be there, you know, or non-Peruvians or non-indigenous, would be people that were there on oil business. So it was just really like the shaman picked me up at the airport, right? Like, and now, you know, they have vans and, you know, lux accommodations, and I'm like, you know, in a lean-to with some leaves covering me and tarantulas in the bathroom, and, you know, very, very different now. I mean, I think those types of experiences are still available, but now we have a greater choice based on, you know, I love, you know, how Steve Byer puts it. You know, you have to assess your risk tolerance, right? So we didn't have the option to do that. Pretty much, they were the places that you could go to drink ayahuasca, and there wasn't a lot to choose from. Now you can like actually go to a really remote location where you might be, you know, 5 hours or a day from a medical facility, or you can go to a place that's, you know, an hour down the road that's relatively safe with all kinds of staff on place and, you know, ways to transport you out in a hurry. So I think that what has presented itself are a lot more options. But also with that, there have been a proliferation of, you know, practitioners that are not necessarily as well trained as we might hope them to be. So it can be really dicey trying to figure out where to go.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks. I'd love to get into that a little bit more as we move forward. Sort of how to choose, what to look out for. If I may, I'm going to shift over to Ryan just so we can bring you into the conversation. Again, thanks so much, Ryan. So I first connected with you, Ryan, I believe through your work with veterans for entheogenic therapy. I'd love to hear a little bit about your motivation for launching that and how it's been going and what it is. And then also what brought you to ayahuasca, what your interest in plant medicines is. So if you're comfortable giving us a little just sort of background of the path or paths that led you there, we'd love to hear.
Absolutely. And thank you guys for having me. I know I missed the workshop before, and I'm just grateful to be here and be able to share with everyone that's online and you all. Yeah, the inspiration for me came very similarly. I'm sorry, I've got kids in the background. It came very similarly to a lot of other veterans who are doing this underground therapy work. I was first introduced to dimethyltryptamine. I served in the Marine Corps from 2007 to 2011 on active duty with the infantry. And during that time, I had lost a friend in the barracks who had just gotten back from Iraq. And I was busy burying Marines at Arlington National Cemetery. And just that experience of holding death really opened me up and primed me for this opening towards alternative plant treatment. And after I lost my friend Sergeant Leon in the barracks, we had found him. He had taken his own life. And after that experience, you know, it really opened me up to what PTSD is and how deep and vast that rabbit hole goes. And it was the nature of his suicide that really shook things up for me. So I knew that something that I wanted to get into this service work. So I got out of the Marine Corps. I finished my 4-year enlistment, took my honorable, and moved down to Alabama to start going to school on the GI Bill. And while I was in community college working on my 2-year degree, I met a friend who introduced me to DMT in school. And I did underground psychedelic therapy with him. And that was my first ever experience with psychedelics at all. I had no idea. I just thought psychedelics was a thing of the 60s. Like, what is that? There was maybe some cool art that came out of it, and some women's suffrage movements and all sorts of great things, but I just didn't link that movement with a drug, you know. And I just started doing the research after DMT, and that DMT experience opened me up, wide open. I got the message very clear. I had my interaction with beings, as Terrence calls it, the machine elves, and it was very clear that I was supposed to be moving toward working with compassionate care. And so shortly after that, I had the inspiration. I watched a few documentaries and started following maps. And shortly after that, I found the inspiration to gear this toward what I already was, which was a veteran, to help other veterans who were diagnosed with treatment-resistant PTSD. And I created the nonprofit, which we're still filing status for, Veterans for Entheogenic Therapy. And if anybody out there is a veteran, feel free to connect with us on Facebook. Just search for Veterans for Entheogenic Therapy. And what we do is we do social activism work. We advocate for the use of plant medicine, plant-based medicine, including cannabis, ayahuasca. We also advocate for MDMA, and we're a big supporter of MAPS and getting behind the movement of psychedelic research. And on the other side, since my journeys to Peru last year in July, I took 5 treatment-resistant veterans with PTSD down to Peru to drink ayahuasca. And so that really opened me up to the research side of things, which just gave me total inspiration to start looking at measuring behavioral changes with the use of ayahuasca over the course of a year. And as you know, me and Rick Doblin have been working very closely on developing this protocol, which we hope to have approved by next year through the Institutional Review Board process, which is just such a long process. It's amazing how difficult it is to provide psychoeducation to an entire board and also draft a protocol and extinguish fires around safety and answering emails. And it's just been a great process, and I'm really excited and hopeful. So there's the study side of it, and that has really led me, I guess I really owe ayahuasca. The inspiration that I got from ayahuasca has led me out here to Colorado to attend Naropa University to pursue my master's degree in transpersonal counseling psychology. And I'm almost done with my master's now, and I hope to eventually be a psychedelic therapist, because I think that what other paradigm to use the integration process with the use of ayahuasca than what Stan Groff had created and helped created out of psychology, which was the transpersonal, the spiritual psychology. I just think it's a great model to really harness the experiences and help integrate what ayahuasca can do for people with severe mental illness. So that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's an amazing trajectory, Ryan. I just think it's so inspirational, just to see that trajectory, and now you're just actively educating yourself and trying to find a way that you can give back and just keep that momentum going. That's just really inspiring.
Thanks, Brad, and you as well. Everyone on this panel and everyone that's listening right now, thank you guys for showing up and continuing to support this, because there is still a stigma out there around these drugs. And even though the momentum's gaining, I'm really hopeful. Like, the more people I talk to about this stuff, coming out of the closet, so to speak, it's just getting so much more momentum. I'm so hopeful, and thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And veterans have been an incredible driving force behind that and behind all the support that we're seeing now for psychedelic therapy, for sure. Could you tell us a little bit, Ryan, just real briefly about the observational study that you're planning? Just kind of how that would work? Oh, you're on.
Sure. So we're doing this observational study. It's been in progress since January of this year. I first started drafting the protocol. which for any potential researchers out there, expect with psychedelic therapy, psychedelic protocols, if you're going through your IRB at your school or you're interested in it, expect at least a year to get these protocols approved. And just, I've learned so much patience with this process and self-care, definitely. But the observational study we're doing is MAP sponsored, and it will involve 12 veterans, all diagnosed with treatment-resistant PTSD, who have tried other therapies that are being offered at the VA, that have tried medications, most of which are sedating, or they're what I call allopathic medicines, which treat symptoms as a means to cure, which is bass backwards. It's the boom of Western medicine, in my opinion. And so they'll be ingesting ayahuasca after the screening phase of doing EKGs and stress tests and making sure that their bodies are in good shape to ingest ayahuasca, as well as make sure that they're not on any antidepressants or medications whatsoever. So there's a huge safety piece to this that we're covering, and very extensive criteria to meet. And so they'll travel. We're going to work with a center in Peru that Rick had originally suggested to me to use, which is the Temple of the Way of Light, with a good friend, Matt. So since then, things haven't worked out with that center. So I've actually been doing research and scouting for centers here in the United States who are protected under the Religious Freedoms Act. I did some work with Jonathan Goldman out at the Santo Daime Church in Oregon, which was a great experience. And I think the center that we found that's locked in that we're going to use is the Soul Quest Akaluva Native American Church based in Florida, Orlando. And they are protected under the Native American Church. So it's great to see that we can send veterans and keep them stateside, where there's more risks involved, like Sita was saying. If you go to Peru, there are definite physical risks, and even though that I had traveled there with patients last year and it was successful, I think minimizing those risks by keeping veterans within the United States, helping them feel a little more connected to the land here, and then they'll be coming back to Boulder. I forgot to mention that all the veterans that are going to be participants are local veterans here in Boulder or Denver, Boulder metro area. And so when they get back over the course of a year, I'll be following them using psychometrics that measure PTSD severity. We'll be using the CAP scale. We'll be using post-traumatic growth inventory, which I think is a new up-and-coming measurement that really focuses on the positive attributes of meaning making toward PTSD versus like diagnosis. I think it's a very progressive measurement. We'll be using a sleep study, Pittsburgh Sleep Index, and since this is a spirituality workshop, I'm excited to share that I'm now bringing in the mystical experience questionnaire to look at is there a correlation between a drop in the severity scale for PTSD and mystical experience, which is cool. Excellent. I think it's totally linked. So I'm really excited, and we'll be doing follow-ups at the 3-month mark, the 6-month mark, and the 12-month mark. And during that time as well, I've been networking here in Boulder with transpersonal counseling therapists, somatic therapists, equine therapists. My friend Jean-Jacques has a horse ranch that has offered to do this and work with veterans on a horse ranch. I had the privilege to work with the horses out there, and I just think it's going to be a great experience for them to have a PTSD workshop with horses. It's amazing to see like all of these therapies out here in Boulder. That's sort of, it just fits the puzzle piece of what ayahuasca represents overall. And so yeah, just all these different therapies. They'll be working with Saj at the Love and Trauma Center, who's an MDMA therapist. They'll be working with Marcella, who's offered up her services as well, and she's another MDMA therapist. We have contemplative therapists at Naropa. interns that have offered to do this as part of their internship at Naropa. It's amazing to see how this will play out and how it will maximize the results over the course of a year. I think because ayahuasca in and of itself is a great tool, but I think followed up with the integrative care over the course of a year, my prediction is that we'll see a significant drop in their scores.
I really hope that plays out. That could be the basis for a really, really strong, really powerful clinical trial down the road that could ultimately make ayahuasca a prescription treatment.
Yeah, I'm hopeful because my eventual goal, my biggest goal, is to eventually bring the results of this study, if we can do it over the course of 4 or 5 years, depending on funding and everything else. I would love to take these results to the VA and the Department of Defense and say, you know, look, as a veteran, I've done this research and I would like to see an outsourcing program in the VA where they would allow veterans who are treatment resistant to go to approved centers within the United States as part of the VA healthcare system. That's,
maybe it'll save the VA some money on medications.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Ryan. That's awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Gosh, so much exciting work happening in that area. And Sita, you mentioned, you know, and, you know, with Ryan, your study, you know, we're talking about American veterans. And Sita, you mentioned the difference between now and in the late 90s in South America at these retreat centers where you were the only Caucasian person there. So I want to make sure that we really explicitly, you know, highlight that that ayahuasca has been part of indigenous traditions for a very, very, very long time. And what ayahuasca is not a new compound. It is not a new thing, but it is new for Western culture. To have such popularity and to have so many people from the West going down to South America and other places, bringing economic resources, but also changing the culture with them. Yeah, Sita, I just want to go to the first question we have on the page, which is, could you give us a little bit of background on how ayahuasca has been used traditionally? And then maybe we can juxtapose that with the direction it's going.
Yeah. So I just want to offer a caveat that, you know, my experience while long duration has been in a very specific tradition, you know, in the Shipibo Kanibo, with the Shipibo Kanibo Indians. So there are many mestizo practices. There's many practices, you know, all across Peru and Brazil and Ecuador, and they're different practices, Colombia. So, you know, speaking broadly, ayahuasca has been used to heal from the spiritual dimension, and also to look into community situations and community problems, to assist in traveling, or, you know, outside this time-space dimension, for hunting, for planting, for community wellness, for protection, and speaking specifically in the Shipibo tradition, the concept is that, you know, whatever we're manifesting in the physical realm, even if it's a broken arm, has its root cause in the spiritual dimension. So maybe you broke your arm because you tripped over something, but you weren't paying attention. But the reason why you weren't paying attention, maybe because there was, you know, a malos espiritu hanging around you that, you know, caused you to be distracted. And so working from the spiritual dimension then manifests results in all dimensions, including the physical, the intellectual, the emotional. So, and it's, you know, and I say that, you know, as part of the indigenous tradition, but it's also applicable to us here every day. You know, we change our mind, we change our life, we change our mind, we change our body and our heart and our soul, and, you know, the way our brain works. And traditionally, you know, the record's pretty scarce, right? We're talking about jungle cultures where there isn't a very secure and large archaeological record, because we're in a geographic region where everything disintegrates and essentially composts pretty quickly. The kind of artifacts we do in some other ancient cultures. So a lot of the information about how long ayahuasca has been used is a bit of a guess, actually. I think that there are a lot of people who, are seeking validation, and they'll say thousands and thousands of years. Well, we don't necessarily know that. What we have is an oral tradition of stories that have been told from one generation to the next. So if I'm talking to, Ricardo or one of the other, contemporaries or elders in the Shipibo communities in which I'm, affiliated and working and learning and studying and practicing in Peru, they'll say, my teacher or their father or their grandfather, and maybe that person's told a story of their grandfather. So it really only goes back so far. But what we do know is that originally, many people in the communities did not actually drink ayahuasca. The shaman drank ayahuasca to gain access to the information and insight about what the patient required or what happened or how to find that lost article or to see what other plant to prescribe. Particularly in the Shipibo tradition, there is a very long tradition of dieta, and not just dieta in preparation for an ayahuasca ceremony, but dieting with specific plants for healing. But how we come to know what those plants are to be prescribed is through taking ayahuasca and having the vision or having a plant come to the practitioner or a connection with the plant that the practitioner has dieted to understand this is going to be really good for this patient. And then there's a prescription of this plant and a period of abstaining from certain things in certain situations, or maybe a period of isolation, which is different than plant dietas and periods of isolation while people are apprenticing to become practitioners. And that isn't to say that no one in the community drank ayahuasca, but primarily it was the shaman who drank the ayahuasca. And even now, with the practitioners and the shamans that, I sit with in Peru, like last year, for example, I was in a private ceremony with a friend and an amazing woman shaman. It was just like, on the living room, the kids are there, the whole family is there, and not everybody's drinking ayahuasca, but, it's part of the culture and part of the cosmology, yet there's information being divined as a result of drinking ayahuasca about the other participants in the ceremony, whether they're drinking or not. And there's also, historically a culture of people coming to ceremony just to receive a song or to receive a treatment, and then they might leave the ceremony. Then over time, what happened was there was a bit of this shift, tradition and culture is ever emerging. And, so there are people from the north coming to experience this. And you mentioned how ayahuasca seems akin to LSD in terms of this explosion, right? This like idea like, wow, here's this powerful tool that we can use to affect transformation personally, transpersonally, and culturally. And a bit of that is happening with ayahuasca as well. So the people that are coming to the jungle aren't coming to the jungle to say, I just want to come to the ceremony and have the shaman drink ayahuasca and have a look at me, right? They want to have the experience themselves. But that's created a bit of a feedback loop such that the center where I go and where I work and where my colleagues are, Niue Rao, essentially the shamans are now in their lexicon, in the language, in the chanting, they're chanting for traumas, where that wasn't part of their vocabulary before. But what they're seeing is that people are coming, for healing work, because primarily like the work that I'm involved in is that direct healing work. I mean, certainly there's work where people are going to have an ayahuasca experience to expand consciousness. And I'm not saying that that isn't healing, but this is like specific healing work. And so there's a bit of a feedback loop because perhaps some of the initial difficulties, problems, concerns, ailments, worries of Northerners were not the same as those in the Shipibo communities. But the shamans are saying, okay, this is helping. And so we're going to, do the work and do the healing work that is required. And so there has been this really beautiful witnessing of this feedback loop where now the participants are all drinking ayahuasca as well. And what I'm seeing is a real encouragement to connect with the medicine within and to cultivate resources within. Whereas before, you know, you have the shaman. Shaman's the healer. You know, somebody else in the community is, you know, growing potatoes. Somebody else is building canoes. And so everybody has their job. It's an integrated whole community that's functioning. So when you're sick, you go to the shaman and you give the shaman a chicken and the shaman says, do X, Y, and Z. I see this in you, take these plants. You go back to work, right? You don't have to be the shaman. And it works. What we're seeing now is more self-responsibility for our healing. And I think that's really a good thing, because what we also don't want to do is, like, in those cultures, it really worked. Here and now, whether it's in Peru or in ayahuasca drinking cultures that are emerging, you know, here in the north, across Europe and Asia and Russia, what we don't want to do is create a dependency. Okay, now I have a problem, so I'm going to go see the shaman, right? You know, we already live in a very dependent, habituated, addicted culture. So, so from that respect, also, it's changing. But, you know, if we go way back, you know, in the traditional settings, it was not something where people were utilizing it so much for, I think, personal transformation or expansion of consciousness, but more community-based and tribal-based, like, what's going to benefit our community? Because certainly if there's one person who's being plagued by, you know, negative energies or brujeria, like, we want to clean it up so that the whole community can thrive and be well.
Wow. Yeah, it's a much more than one directional process. It looks like it's not just Westerners going down to Peru and messing everything up. It's like there's things changing on both sides, and right.
Well, yeah, and at the same time, you know, I observe there is still, at least in the Shipibo culture, you know, out of all of the you know, tribal cultures in the Upper Amazon, the Shipibo Kanibo have really maintained their autonomy and a sense of their cultural identity more than any other group. And so while they are being of service to the gringos, they're also maintaining their own practice. And, you know, because I have developed intimate relationships over all of these years of, you know, studying and apprenticing and working with the Shipibo, I see the difference between how they interact around the medicine with themselves and how they actually interact with gringos around the medicine. So like, I don't want to kid ourselves that all of a sudden, like, the Shipibo are like adopting all of, you know, our ideas and notions for themselves. You know, so there are still some, you know, dividing lines. And I also think that that's important to note, because I don't want to forget about, like, the historical context of these very people being oppressed and the attempts to eviscerate their entire culture, right? So, like, in terms of their, you know, heritage and, you know, the, you know, multi-generational history of their own trauma, there is also, I see, a protectiveness, which is actually, ironically, benefited us, because they've maintained their identity and said, you can't take this from us, you know, and now we're saying, can you give us more? Can you give us more of, like, of, you know, but the work, and I just really want to honor and respect, you know, their own, you know, sense of themselves to maintain their identity and be carriers of this medicine and this, you know, powerful potential for healing that now, once again, you know, we're coming in and, like, asking for. So, like, you know, so it's tricky. It's a very complex kind of relationship, you know, not just between cultures, but individuals and individual relationships with the medicine. And I'm, as I said, talking about the Shipibo, and then there's the whole, like, mestizo population that also, I don't want to say co-opted, but absorbed the practices of the indigenous with these various plants. And then there's the folding in of Christianity and other beliefs. So I just feel like we can't just say the indigenous do it this way and put it in a box and say that's what it is. But hopefully I've offered a little bit of a window into some of the history, and some of the current practices and how they're emerging.
Outstanding. Thank you. That's amazing. What a great reflection. And Ryan, I want to encourage you to jump in if you have any commentary or reflections based on what Sita is saying, or vice versa. I want this to be a conversation as much as possible, so feel free to just kind of jump on in.
Great.
Yeah. Wow, that's amazing. So, since there's so many people, seeking out ayahuasca for all of these reasons, some of which are even new, you're saying, to the cultures
Right.
in question. I'm wondering, if either of you have suggestions for people who are seeking these experiences out, ways that they can do it not only the most effectively, but also the most responsibly and sustainably, and then also the most safely. And I want to make sure that we leave a little bit of time to talk specifically about some of the challenges that are primarily present for women. There's been many examples of sexual assault occurring in ceremonies, and I want to make sure that that's spoken about. That, of course, that also happens for men who are seeking out ayahuasca experience. Sexual assault happens there too, so I want to leave time there. So what, in your opinions, based on your experience, or what's the best way to find a ceremony or a center for somebody who's seeking out these experiences?
Well, I'd like to speak to that and maybe comprehensively answer all of it in one, if I can.
Amazing.
So
Amazing.
I think first and foremost, to understand your purpose, like why are you doing this, right? And to get really clear about that, and to the extent that you can, to have it in an intentionality, right? So, like, even if it's that I'm curious, like, no, okay, I'm curious. Why am I curious? And to really do that self-examination. And at the same time, or when you have that clarity, to really take self-responsibility, maintain your critical faculty, and exercise discernment. And I have some specific suggestions on how to do that. And it's a little bit more difficult with some centers than others because of communication difficulties. Some of them are remote, and you're, communicating, only by email, and they have satellite internet, or, in other situations where you're not in the jungle and you're in, a more technologically connected setting, it's a little bit easier. So, I think that in terms of exercising discernment and maintaining critical faculty, the key things to know are who is the practitioner and what is their training, to have the opportunity to ask the questions that you want to ask or feel you need to ask to make an empowered decision. And there should be some kind of screening process, and that screening process is bilateral. It's not just that, the center or the shaman or the practitioner is screening you, but you're actually interviewing them. And if you're not given the opportunity to do that, that's a bit of a red flag. To know what plants are being administered. We talk about ayahuasca, and ayahuasca, primarily is a combination of two plants. The common plant is the ayahuasca vine, the Banisteriopsis caapi, but then it could be with chacruna, or it could be with chalipanga, or some people put other admixture plants in. So not just with ayahuasca, but with anything that you're ingesting, you want to know specifically what it is you're ingesting and where it came from. And to be able to ask those questions and get a clear answer, even if you're talking about, a center in the jungle. For example, at Niwa Rao, it's, Cielo ayahuasca that comes from the Loreto region, and it's chacruna, the Psychotria viridis, that's actually flown in from the Ucayali region, which is the homeland of the Shipibo. Most centers around Iquitos use chalipanga, which is Diplateris, because that is what grows in that bioregion up into Ecuador. So I think that these things are important because the alkaloids in Chalipanga are slightly different than the alkaloids in the chacruna. The other thing is, are they putting tobacco in it? Are they putting other plants in it? All of these things are really important to know, whether it's Peru or anywhere else in the world. And then, what is the format of the ceremony? Because all of these things will provide information to say, am I resonating with that? Because there's so many different ways that the ceremonies are done. There are celebratory ceremonies. There are ceremonies like in the Santo Daime, which are more, religiously oriented and more structured, where people, dress a certain way and dance and sing hymns and the lights are on and there's certain rounds of, receiving the daime. So all of these things are really important to know so that you say, does this feel like a fit for me? And, I always say, just because someone's pouring doesn't mean you have to drink. And I think that's really important to remember, to understand that you get to be at choice and you get to have as much information as you need before making a decision, and to not feel like, but here's my opportunity and I don't know if it's going to come around again, to just like relax. And hopefully you can find that place of trusting that when the time is right and the setting is right, it'll fall into place, and not feel like, wow, this doesn't feel exactly right, but I don't know if I'm going to get another chance. Like, that's not a good starting place. So, and then, the other thing is, what are the safety measures that are in place? How important is safety? And that isn't to say that, there's an absolute standard of some sort, but again, it goes back to your risk tolerance. Do you feel comfortable drinking ayahuasca in a remote location that, is a day's ride up the river by a boat, and, there's very minimal, first aid? And it's not because the ayahuasca is going to do something, but if you get bit by a snake or you get hit over the head, what are you going to do? And you're out, so all of these things are factors to be taken into consideration, and, what is the medical care that's available? Because certainly, anything can happen anywhere. And you want to have, an understanding of the capacities and what is in place in the event of an emergency of any sort whatsoever. Because you can imagine there's a ceremony, people are under the influence of ayahuasca, and there's an earthquake, right? Like, anything can happen. So just to have a really good sense of, what this group is, who's holding the space. The other thing is the number of practitioners to participants. Do you want to be involved in a ceremony where there's 35 people and a shaman and 2 helpers, where it's more of a group situation? Are you looking for something that's more of an individual healing situation? And also, what questions are they asking you? Are they asking you for a medical history? Are they asking you, for a history of, your past, prescriptions, herbals, current prescriptions, herbals, trauma history, mental health history, previous experience with entheogens, your purpose, your intention? So all of these things, play into, I believe, setting the stage for the most powerful and productive experience. And then, and the other part of it is the preparation, and part of the preparation is planning in advance for the integration, right? So there's the preparation, and making sure that we're abstaining from things that would be contraindicated. The ceremony, which is a catalyst, and I think that Ryan really touched on this. There's the experience, but then what happens afterwards? The integration of that experience is key. And so to actually plan for the integration, and do the practitioners or do the center, like, have either somebody to refer you to that you can be in touch with once you go home, or on site, or if you're someplace else in the world, what is the potential for the integration work? Do they have people on hand that they can refer you to in the event that, something comes up that can't be resolved or settled over the course of the time that you're there for whatever reason? So all of these things, I think, set the stage for, a safe, powerful, and an effective way to experience plant medicine. And I think, the final note is to approach it with respect, and to actually set aside the time for yourself in advance, time for contemplation, time to be away from the distractions, away from the foods that are not harmonious with ayahuasca and with monoamine oxidase inhibitors, and time to really, because I believe the ceremony starts when we decide to come to ceremony. It's not when we're sitting there, right? So it's that preparation. It's that time of, what's my purpose? Why am I doing this? And it's really amazing when we approach it that way. What we find is a lot of the work happens before we even get to the ceremony, because we're raising our awareness. And, you know, when we rate our awareness is consciousness, so we're already raising our consciousness. So when we come to the ceremony in an elevated state of consciousness, I just think that we're better prepared. And then for the healing part, once we do all of this preparation, hopefully we have decided to participate in a set and setting with practitioners that we already have some degree of trust. And so having that degree of trust allows us to be more open to receive the plants and receive the healing. But if we go in protective because we're like, I don't know about these people, but I'm going to do it anyway, you know, it can cause a choke, right? And it can cause like things to get crossed up. But we're like, okay, I feel really good about this. And maybe I've talked to other people. I've gotten a referral from somebody. I've done my homework. I feel really good. And so then we can really open into the experience, because, you know, the resistance, you know, one of the questions had to do with like the shadow and dark things that come up. Well, you know, it's very difficult to not resist when we're already coming in resistant, right? But when we're coming in trusting and we understand, like, I believe these people are holding, you know, a safe, loving space for me. When those troublesome times or the challenging moments come up, like somewhere in our consciousness, we know I'm well prepared. I feel like I'm being held, and it's going to be okay.
Wow, amazing. Sita, do you have this information available? Do you make this available? Because that's the most coherent, I think, useful overview I've ever heard for people who are seeking this out. Ryan, do you have anything to add?
Or you know, everything that she's covered has been things that I've worked with the board on for a year, trying to research and do this out of the basement of my house, like because there's nothing out there that's available. The closest thing I found is the Ayahuasca Manifesto, as far as text, and there's been other books too that I've read, journeys. With I think Goldman went down and wrote a book about it, and ayahuasca medicine, there's another book about it. But in general, you know, a lot of what she's covered already is everything that should go into a ceremony, from start to finish. It's this starting and this completing that needs to happen that is crucial, and it is designed for specific populations, which has been one of the reasons I've been scouting out centers, is because I'm getting into the mind of a veteran diagnosed with PTSD. And just so happens the religious context at Santo Daime wasn't working out for what I felt would be appropriate for the veterans, especially some that are Purple Heart recipients that are missing limbs, that can't get up and sing and dance for the ceremony. And I totally respected the ceremony, and I think the Shipibo tradition is something that we're gearing more toward.
Daddy, guess what Tanner did?
Uh-oh.
He filled up the whole water.
Uh-oh. Okay. He filled up the whole water.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Sita, you covered so much, and
there's more.
Yeah, there's so much more. This is such an infinite realm, and part of this protocol is putting all of this and laying worries to rest with you know, doctors and psychiatrists that are reviewing this thing, because they have the same concerns that I think you expressed, Sita, and that I feel the same toward the veterans as part of this protocol. And the psychoeducation is the biggest piece to this. It's not, it's what helps fear. It's the best method for fear around doing these ceremonies, is to have these conferences and talk about these things.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, Brad, I will say is you just like kind of inspired me. Maybe I will write this all down. I mean, this, you know, I have many conversations week in, week out, and I do integration work with people. And so a lot of this has come from like actual work. Like, I'm going to say starting, like, I mean, for me, my first 4 years were like taking out the trash. in terms of my own personal work with ayahuasca. But by that point, I was already apprenticing, so at this juncture, it's, many years of experience and talking to people and working with people on the other side of the experience, in the integration work and gathering information and refining processes and understanding. So maybe I will write it down and then figure out a forum by which to share that or something. And maybe you and I can talk about it.
Yeah, I have a couple ideas for that actually.
Okay.
Yeah, the Maps Bulletin may be a interesting venue for that.
So I want to add a couple of things in terms of resources. Unfortunately, there isn't an ayahuasca clearinghouse of, rated practitioners and shamans. But one of the things that I will direct people to is the ICEER's website, which is very rich and very well referenced and resourced and very thoughtful and I believe very reliable. And then the other thing is with respect to centers, shamans, and even practitioners not in Peru, search on Google, do your internet, homework and talk to people who have been there, because there are practitioners who, ayahuasca also, it's not like everything's light and airy and angels and, the heaven's going to open up and everything's going to be bright and lovely, right? Because we're talking about something that has its roots in a shamanic practice, which is neither light nor dark and can be both. And there are people that work, with the dark medicine aspect as well. And so I think it's really important to be aware of that. And I believe that there's enough information out there now about practitioners and shamans who have sexually abused women. And so I think, unfortunately, there's all of these databases now where you can look up parishes and priests that have had charges, levied against them. Like we're not there with ayahuasca for many, many reasons. But I think it's really important to do your homework. And also, there's so many people, my maestro sexually abused women and I left him. And it was so painful for me because I was entrenched in the whole family and the whole community. And when it came to my attention, I thought, I got very clear, you can't be a healer and an abuser. And I left. And I was the only one that left. And I never went back because I thought, if I go there, I'm sending a message to people, And so part of it is, understanding that there is no consent when someone's in a position of power is one component. And then the other component is speaking truth to power. Right? The Quaker way, speaking truth to power and, continually seeking people who can tell the truth and speak freely. So, I've come across a lot of people who even today have the information about people who have engaged in abusive practices and not just sexual abuse, but monetary abuse and emotional abuse, and trickster kind of abuse. And they look the other way because on the other side of that, this is like a really powerful shaman. So they feel like they're getting the big juice. And so they become enchanted by that. So to just be aware of the potential for enchantment. And as I said, don't mistake the practitioner for the plants. There are no gurus, right? And really, I believe a good shaman and a good practitioner is reflecting the medicine that you have within and helping you to cultivate your own inner resources. And practitioners do some things. And I think that because of their experience with the medicine and a deep understanding of how it works in the spiritual dimensions and in other ways and physiologically can direct those energies in a specific way. But ultimately, we're doing the work. Right? We're doing the work with guidance. So to not, fall into traps of dependency or being told you need me to be able to do this, and particularly, some of the tricks are you're special, I see you have the capacity to be a great shaman or, you're really beautiful and, you know, no one has ever, you know, affected me the way you have, or somebody starts to put their hand, you know, on your person and it doesn't feel comfortable, that's where the critical faculty. So even when you're in the medicine, prepare yourself, say, okay, you know, this is, you know, my agency, my domain, maintain those boundaries, and to prepare yourself in advance for it. Like, so to just understand, like, you know, there are potential pitfalls anywhere. Like if we were to go, you know, to a doctor's office, and, you know, recently I heard a story of somebody went for something and the doctor, like, inappropriately did a breast exam, like, and the patient knew, like, something's not right. Like, this is not like an appropriate examination for what I'm here for. Like, you kind of know. And I think that when we're under the influence of a psychotropic substance, that it can be very difficult to navigate and it can be confusing already. So to just like understand going in, like, what your own personal boundaries are. And if
I think that's what,
right, trust your gut, trust your intuition.
I think that's a really important point, so I want to highlight it. A lot of people I've spoken to who've journeyed to South America or just undergone ayahuasca ceremonies have gone into it with the attitude of, oh, this is a place for my boundaries to fall away. To fully open my consciousness and open myself to whatever may come. It sounds like what you're saying is that still, even in those situations, there's still a place for boundaries of sorts.
Right. Open yourself fully to the plants. But, you know, like, for example, like in a ceremonial setting, there should be an instructed. Participants are not to touch each other. If, you know, and in many of the Shipibo, like in, you know, at Niue Rao, there's no touching, specifically because of misinterpretations. But in like the traditional Shipibo practice, like they do all of this like really deep, like going in and digging into your intestines. And there's all these other practices that most people don't know about, because as Westerners, like, they don't do that. That's what I'm saying. Like, so like in the communities, they're doing some things that are very hands-on. But then, you know, like, it can be misinterpreted or it can be uncomfortable. So to just, you know, understand that I believe, like, if I'm working with somebody, I don't care how many times they've sat in front of me, I say, do I have permission to do work for you? And like, you know, if the answer is not yes, the answer is not yes. Like, and that's a very important reference question. Or even if, you know, because I do work outside of ceremony with diets, with, you know, Pusanga work. You know, if I'm going to touch someone, I'm like, can I touch your face? Are you okay with hands-on work? Right? Like, just very clear communication and permissions. I think it's really important. You know, and that doesn't always happen. And sometimes, you know, it's implied that it's okay. But I believe that on some level we know. And ayahuasca happens to be the kind of experience where, yeah, you know, maybe if you're given so much that you're, you know, completely out of your mind, you know, which I don't necessarily recommend, because that doesn't create the opportunity to actually engage with the medicine. You know, like Luna says, it's like dreaming while awake, right? And if you think about that, there is a presence and an awareness, and there is a lucidity at the same time that there's an expansion. So in those moments, like, you know, and to cultivate both at the same time, and granted, all of this may take practice, you know, to navigate these experiences. But I think that one of the things that is so unique about ayahuasca is that there is that potential for clarity and lucidity at the same time as, you know, being in a state of, you know, altered perception and consciousness.
I agree, Sita. I'm just so inspired by how much you've gone into this, and I have this dialogue at Naropa with the faculty there in terms of ethics, and part of my practicum working at a high school with at-risk youth. We do this check-in once a week, and I work with this my instructor, who's a PhD and has worked in the court system, working with domestic violence cases as a forensic psychologist. And we're just harping on the mental health statutes, and there's so many. You know, this touching piece is a huge one. Informed consent,
Yeah.
mandatory reporting, just so many different areas that I think the mental health system here, if we can work with statutes as a model, working with ayahuasca, because I've met a Shipibo shaman who also expressed this need of working more toward spiritual crisis intervention than working directly as like this messianic healer, you know, this
Right. Yes.
guru. And
Ah.
he made it very clear, and I was very impressed with his take on it, is that during that ceremony last year, I had the opportunity to go to Phoenix ayahuasca and work with the shaman there, and he would just allow this process to come up for people. And when it did, he was very ripe in the moment, ready to go over and make sure that they needed help. It was Stan Groff talks about the spiritual crisis a lot, and working more toward like this intervention approach to help ground the participants more so than being this crazy teacher, guru, brujo. You know, just it's amazing to see how this work should be carried out, and the ethics that come with it are so important.
Well, and you touched on the, you know, something that I think is very important, and, you know, we probably don't have time to go into too much detail, but, you know, so many of the people that come to ayahuasca, whether they're vets or not, are suffering from multiple traumas. And oftentimes those traumas are traumas of sexual abuse, or, you know, witnessing sexual abuse or violence. And, you know, they're hypervigilant and they're really sensitive to touch. And so, like, you don't want to touch somebody, particularly when there's awareness in ayahuasca, you know, like, so you really have to be very careful. I mean, I think over time you can work toward utilizing the modality of ayahuasca to not be hypersensitive, or to be able to cultivate, like, when it's okay and when it's not okay. Because for traumatized populations, it's just none of it is okay. And you never know. And you don't, and like, you know, so I think that's particularly important in working, you know, with people who have experienced, you know, a multitude of traumas. And like I said, you know, I personally see that there is a disproportionate number of people who come to ayahuasca healing practices. And I'm talking about like coming to ayahuasca for specific healing treatment. You know, it's trauma, with a large portion being, you know, sexual abuse trauma and addiction.
And addiction, which go hand in hand.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So like, you're traumatized and you dissociate, and, you know, the endogenous opiates kick in, you feel safe, and then later on you're looking for that same safe feeling and you turn to drugs. Like, I mean, obviously that's a very simplistic explanation, but to, you know, work in the realm of fortifying someone so that they feel secure and safe in who they are, and then to open things up and start to work with the trauma, as opposed to, like, you know, and letting them go through that process of, you know, spiritual crisis. Like, spiritual crisis doesn't mean that there's something wrong. It means like, okay, ripping it apart so that we can like put it back together, you know, as opposed to being held on so tight and rigid and like stuck in the trauma.
Yeah, it's this ego. And Rick Doblin and I had this conversation early on when we were developing this protocol. An ideal situation would be to have veterans do MDMA work, do some ego strength work prior to getting that ego intact, you know, because the gestalt of all of this is to make sure they're going in with a strong ego. And
it actually can be done right with the ayahuasca too. That's the thing, if you have a savvy practitioner. But I totally believe, because like back in the day, you know, ayahuasca wasn't so available, right? So like, there'd be like, you know, and obviously there needs to be a waiting period and an integration. But you know, the empathogenic nature of MDMA is really powerful and really helps to build your sense of self. However, you know, in the shamanic practice, there also is this concept of cleaning and clearing and fortifying. So what you want to do is clean, clear, fortify before you open stuff up, and before you try to, you know, actually process and integrate the trauma, you know, and understanding that processing and integrating the trauma, what was like your, you know, greatest pain turns into your greatest strength. It turns into your actual medicine, right?
Right.
But yeah, that fortification, centering, balancing before you rip it apart.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then putting it back together over the course of a year. I'm still putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. It's been more than a year. You know, there's stuff that's still popping up that I'm like, wow, look at this one.
Yes.
It definitely can't rush it.
And also working with a practitioner who can, from a shamanic perspective, like if you're in a shamanic practice, that is actually sealing and putting protection, you know, in the shamanic tradition too, you know, with the assistance of the plants, because, you know, the plants are there and they're with you even beyond the ceremony. The Icaros are with you even beyond the ceremony, and like placing, you know, those connections that I think also help to, you know, guide the development of like new neural pathways and disintegrate the neural pathways that have become entrenched, you know, in the trauma response system and the hypervigilance.
Yeah, that's so important. Oh my God, Sita, I had no idea. I'm so excited. The way you describe that is like exposure therapy at the VA, what that's being offered as now as the typical modality for treatment for PTSD is EMDR, exposure therapy, and ayahuasca works in a similar mechanism. It brings you to that place where you see your trauma, you work with it. There's this re-traumatization period, and then moving those memories into the prefrontal cortex is the goal of treatment. But it's so difficult when you have these drugs that are being prescribed at the VA, like you know, anxiolytics and stuff that just makes you numb to it. And how can they? It's a catch-22, because how can you?
Right. Yeah, you can't actually process the experience. And the thing is, it's not to avoid the experience. And even with some of the EMDR and the things that want to like recharacterize it, I don't know that I particularly agree with that. Because you know what? This is your experience. This is your life. And this is what's making you who you are today, whether you're, you know, experiencing the symptoms of trauma or not. But like there's a real richness to that. Real richness to that. And to claim it, own it as who you are without being triggered, without being charged. But to understand that as you process that and release it, like it turns into the greatest gift, right? Awesome. And then like yourself, it becomes the gift that you want to share with everybody else, you know, because if you hadn't gone through that trauma, you wouldn't be doing what you're doing and offering it to others.
Right. Ryan, this is actually a really great kind of pivot point. I'd like to get into questions and answers, or at least questions and explorations.
Yeah. Looks like we have a lot.
Yeah, we have quite a few. Actually, the first one is we're talking about trauma now. So Ryan, you're of course very familiar with the work that MAPS is doing with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. So I'm wondering if you might say a little bit about, based on what you know about that, how MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD might differ from ayahuasca-assisted treatment for PTSD, how they might be similar, how they might be different.
Sure. And I'm pretty excited to announce that I'm going for my internships next year to do MDMA-assisted psychotherapy at the Boulder study for MAPS. It's going to be a really cool adventure to work with Marcella next year.
You're actually going to be doing the therapy sessions as one of the intern therapists?
Yep, I'll be co-facilitating.
Amazing.
Yeah, I'm really excited about that. And the biggest piece I can take away from it would be that MDMA is more of an entactogen. It works more with, I guess, the psychological realm, and it works a lot more with the ego. So in that sense, the two work hand in hand. I think they can work together, and the potential for both would definitely only increase the benefit of overall recovery of PTSD. I think MDMA in its own right has the potential to bring that loving kindness and awareness towards self-care, self-awareness, self-love. And on the other side, ayahuasca is more geared toward the breakthroughs, the big spiritual breakthroughs, the meaning making, less so than catharsis. And it has a lot more to do with the purging of the experience. It's like taking out the trash, and MDMA can work sort of on a lighter scale to help integrate the psychology associated with trauma. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think so.
Can I add something to that a little bit?
Please.
You know, I might digress a little bit in this notion of, you know, and I don't like MDMA working more with the ego and ayahuasca being, you know, more the purging and big spiritual breakthroughs. In the tradition in which I've studied it and worked, it's all about the ego. It's all about disillusion of the ego and heart opening. So I think it's very dependent on the practitioner, right? And I think that with MDMA and the therapy that's being done with MDMA, the Mithoffers, and you know the work that's being done, there is kind of not a protocol, but there is a like a theme that's emerging or a way of working with it that's emerging. And with ayahuasca, it's a little trickier because there's so many different ways in which ayahuasca is being worked with. So I think that for some people and maybe some practices, the focus might be on big spiritual breakthroughs or purging the experience. But I know that for me, like, it's not just purging, but it's transformation. When we bring stuff up, it's not about getting rid of it. It's about transmuting it a lot of the time, about reclaiming it, bringing it back in a way that's healthy as opposed to unhealthy. And really that relinquishment of the ego and the mind, because it's, you know, the mind wants to drive the train. And so I think personally, ayahuasca, in my experience and in the experience of people that I've talked to, is really quite a powerful reflection of how, you know, how much our ego wants to hold on and how much our, you know, mind wants to drive the train. So I just want to put out there that there are many different ways to work with ayahuasca. So I think that ayahuasca is also being worked in that same realm of, you know, dropping into the heart, letting go of the mind, dissolving the ego, you know, and transforming these experiences in addition to purging and spiritual breakthroughs.
I agree. I should have, you know, I was thinking about it, ego identity in the sense of like who I am, like who I think I am. The MDMA works for me in my experience more specifically with, sorry guys. MDMA works specifically with how we relate to our own identities. And this is a huge piece in the integration work, is assimilating, bringing back and putting back Humpty Dumpty back together again. And ayahuasca has its own process, and sort of dissolving the ego and bringing it back, I think is something that MDMA might be very effective at in terms of how I'm relating to the trauma, the me that I think I am. Like that me is important, that ego is important, and MDMA, in my experience working with it, has helped tremendously integrate the experience of ayahuasca. And it's more of a practical use, like how do I navigate the world that I'm living in, more so, whereas ayahuasca for me, in my experience, has been super spiritual, super awakening, super transmuting, like you had said, turning it back toward itself, working with shadow, working with just so many different areas that were untouched. And MDMA has really helped me touch inward and looking at those experiences and how I can integrate those experiences into daily traits that have been changed, like my relationship with my family, how I'm turning that around, my relationship with my wife or my friends, or how MDMA has really helped me transmute ayahuasca experiences of letting go and purging and transmuting, and put it into a real practical use for me in my daily life.
That's great. That's actually exactly what Thomas, who asked the original question here in the Q&A, he said that he first experienced ayahuasca ceremonies, and then MDMA kind of helped him do additional work. So it seems like the two could be used together in a certain way.
That's my hope, and that's Rick's hope too. I would love to see both of them together.
Yeah. Another question. Dimitri asked about contraindications. So that would be specifically for ayahuasca, that
Yeah.
would be not just chemical or drug-related contraindications, but also are there mindsets that would indicate that maybe you shouldn't? So what are the situations in which one should not be seeking ayahuasca?
Well,
Yeah.
one of the things, conventional, such that it is, within the scope of ayahuasca thought is that, people who have been diagnosed with bipolar, with at least one manic episode are not good candidates. And again, I think everything is situation and individual, assessment, but like that would be one thing. And in addition to, SSRIs and a host of other pharmaceuticals, there are things, depending on how strict the practice is, like licorice has an MAOI component to it. St. John's wort has an MAOI component to it. There is the unknown factor with many of, the HIV drugs that, interact with SSRIs, but of course nobody is testing all of these things, against harmine, harmaline, tetrahydroharmine. So like we're operating in the realm of like a lot of things that we don't know. I think that that there needs to be a certain degree of groundedness, and focus, and I say that at the same time, understanding that many people come to do the work because they feel ungrounded and they feel out of focus. But there needs to be a certain degree of presence and awareness, as I said, purpose and intention. And sometimes, like I said, conventional thinking, schizophrenics. However, my experience has been that it's very interesting. People who have visionary experiences might be called schizophrenics, and maybe in another context, they might be called, a blossoming shaman. And it's very interesting because I know, a couple of people who have had, diagnosis of psychotic episodes and schizophrenia who have drank ayahuasca and they feel like they're home because this is what is happening in their life that sometimes is uncontrollable. But because in ayahuasca, there is a certain way of managing the experience, like there's a beginning, a middle, and end, it wears off, that then translates in a way to actually harness these visionary experiences and make them productive as opposed to something that keeps them from functioning in their life. So, I'm probably going out on a limb here, and, I'm not saying that, that there is any one pat answer, but I think that good common sense dictates that, there are certain things that, like if you're, in the middle of a psychotic episode or you're in the middle of a manic episode, probably not the best time to drink ayahuasca, right? I also think that if you're experiencing particular difficulty in your life, it can be really helpful to do a little bit of a plant diet with a plant that can help you in advance of drinking ayahuasca. So this concept of dieting and, bringing your attention and your awareness into place before even drinking ayahuasca can be really helpful as well. I don't know if that answered the question, but maybe it did partially.
And Sita, I want to build off of that. That's so important. The contraindications, not just in terms of physical risks, but also mental and spiritual risks associated with it. And in the context of Eastern practice that I work with in my Buddhist practice in school, we view like schizophrenia, for instance, as this more of a shamanic way of living. And we don't see diagnosis as much. We do work with DSM, but we don't take it as seriously as most clinical professions, which I like because there's so much stigma out there. But in terms of risks with mental illness, it brings me back to what LSD did in the 50s, which originally was the key to psychiatrists finding out that schizophrenia is something that doesn't have to do with your mother or your father or your upbringing. It's a chemical thing, and LSD attributes this discovery to understanding schizophrenia. So I love that link is there. And I tell my veterans who work with me through the nonprofit and who I worked with last year in screening, obviously no bipolar, no schizophrenia, no severe pathological disorders of any kind, really, and nothing that's comorbid that could go against, I guess, the realms that you explore on this, because it does induce sometimes heavy states of psychosis.
Yeah.
And as far as contraindications, the biggest risk, I talked with Dennis McKenna and Charlie Grove, who still stick to the MAOIs, the
Yeah.
SRIs, the antidepressants are the biggest risks. But I had a sexual trauma victim last year, Libby, who was in the Air Force, experienced military sexual trauma 20 years ago. That's been struggling with PTSD, and she was on all these medications, and I said, I can't take you down to Peru, and you have to be off of them for at least a month prior to going. And that was just a real boundary I had to put up. And she wanted it bad enough and decided to get off everything, and she tells me to this day that she's happy that she did get off of them.
Right.
So it is worth it. I interact with a lot of
We're not doing the crossplay.
okay, I'll be right there, okay? A lot of these veterans that approach me are saying, they want to do this work, but they can't get off of the medications. They're either addicted to them, or it would be ill-advised by the VA. So what I suggest is that you have to just take that. Sorry, guys. Yeah, just make the suggestion, like, there's a real boundary you have to put up and say, stay off your medications. This is a life or death situation, and that's how I treat it. Just like we were trained to treat weapons in the military. It's life or death. It's important.
And there's another approach that I think is very effective, coming from I practice as utilizing folk remedies and herbalism. The monoamine oxidase inhibition of the ayahuasca vine is reversible. So you return to baseline, within, 12 to 16 hours. And, Parnate was one of the first, pharmaceutical antidepressants, right? And it was at MAOI. So while it's important to follow the strict guidelines, I think for non-reversible MAOIs, when eliminating contraindicated substances, working with the vine alone is really powerful in a dieta format. So people who are on SSRIs, obviously, I'm not a doctor. The shamans aren't doctors. So, you consult with your doctor, but as you are coming off of them, you can diet with just the vine. And there have been amazing results, like people on antidepressants for 25 years. And after the ayahuasca work, to diet with just the vine for a period of time, maintaining the food restrictions, I'm telling you, it's just, and for me, I mean, if I had more time, maybe someday I would really, like to share more about this work. The substance is completely legal. There's nothing scheduled about it, and it's so powerful. It's just really amazing. It really is this natural antidepressant that doesn't stay. And as a plant teacher, we talk about plant teachers, it's akin to Chinese herbal medicine. What it does is it does this reset. And so then there, becomes this, harmonic resonance, our brain pathways and our neural pathways start to sync up with that. And we don't need to keep taking it, right? It's not like something that's palliative or, allopathic medicines that you touched on earlier, but it actually is something that can create real lasting changes. And then we just pick up on it. And, from a mystical perspective of a plant teacher, that's what it's doing. It's actually teaching our systems, whether they be spiritual, physical, emotional, intellectual, psychic, or soul level, how to operate in the most optimal fashion possible. And so for me, I think that, the Banisteriopsis capi holds enormous promise. So
That's amazing, Sita. I had no idea that that was you could use that as an antidepressant. And a lot of the work that I'm doing, I work during my practicums now, I work at a high school, and we work with at-risk youth with addictions. And the name of our program is called Natural Highs. And we work with a lot of Argentinian herbs, yerba mate, passion flower. We work with skullcap and daime, and a lot of these things. We talk about neuroscience and how these herbs are similar to the effects of certain drugs that have negative effects on receptors, on neurotransmitters. Whereas these plants, like mate, which is a valid, we coin a valid substitute for marijuana. It activates the same areas of the brain, but it reinforces those neurotransmitters versus trying to replicate them.
Yes.
And this is the whole process of re-strengthening the connections there.
Right, and I think that this actually, goes back to, the studies by Dennis and others in the late 80s of the ayahuasca using churches in Brazil, where, there was pretty strong evidence that rather than, depleting serotonin reuptake receptor sites, that, long-term drinkers of ayahuasca or daime or huasca actually had more reuptake, sites. So, so it's just really fascinating work. And like I said, for me, the vine is where it's at in many respects. And I think is, we all, many people are like, oh, the N-dimethyltryptamine and the visions and all of that. And that's all great. But, it's really the foundation of the vine that's, I think, really opening us up, because sometimes the visions are a bit of eye candy to keep us occupied while everything else is going on. So,
Yep.
Awesome.
Dribbling basketballs. Yep.
Yeah. There's a question about, we've talked a lot about what's happening in South America, especially, but are there any legal options for people wanting to pursue ayahuasca ceremonies either in North America or in Europe that people might be able to seek out? Or is that restricted only to some very specific religious groups at the time?
Oh, good.
I mean, currently, the Santa Daime and the UDV, Unión de Vegetal, and, Ryan touched on this group in Florida who are, operating under the auspices of the ONAC. And I think that, that is still a legal gray area, because the ONAC, while, is a Native American church, there, have been specific exemptions for the Native American church for peyote, but not for, the use of other plants such as, cannabis or ayahuasca or, Wachuma, San Pedro. So I think that there's a bit of a legal gray area. And I think that there will be more options coming down the pike. There are a number of Santo Daime, churches around the country that have applied for a Schedule I exemption. And, and one here in California that actually called the DA and said, I'm serving ayahuasca. Give me an exemption, and they got it. So I just want to be really clear, about what's happening in Florida and what's with some of the other groups. They're advertising widely. Nothing so far is happening, but technically, I don't think it really, falls under the bright line of an exception under the, Religious Restoration of Freedom Act, or under the bright line of our First Amendment rights in either case.
Yeah, that's, I talked with the founder who opened the chapter under ONAC, Chris Young, and there is a bit of a gray area, and me and Rick and Chris had this conversation over Skype about the legalities, and Chris at this point is sort of the standoff between the DEA and his church, and neither party is moving forward, but Chris has his legal paperwork in order and ready. in
Right.
case they decide to move forward. They just confiscated his ayahuasca that came in, and so he had to take that loss, but there was no pursuit. It was just this confiscation. Now he's waiting to present paperwork to have access to the ayahuasca under religious freedom. So it's still a legal gray area, but I mean, I would definitely go with a church here that operates under the Religious Freedoms Act and protect yourself, as best you can. There's no full protection to it, but definitely work with people that know what they're doing as well.
Yeah, and quite frankly, I'm going to be a bit rogue here, and I would suggest that we have a long history in the United States of fighting for our civil rights, our rights to practice our freedom of speech and religion, and civil rights and all of these things. And how that happens isn't by it being legal in the first place, but how it happens is by people having presence of mind and being true to their beliefs and acting in the face of oppression. So just because something isn't legal doesn't mean that it isn't safe. Just because something isn't legal doesn't mean it isn't in integrity. So, I'm just offering that as an option. I'm not encouraging anybody to do anything illegal by any stretch of the imagination, but I think we all need to take our place in the scheme or the composition of our citizenship and make decisions that feel right for us. And, ayahuasca and other entheogens and psychedelic medicines aren't ever going to become legal if everybody says, well, I can't do it because it's not legal. Like, it's not going to happen that way. And it is the very experience of these plants and these substances calling to us that are opening our minds and saying, okay, now we're going to stand up. And, look at cannabis. And this is something that isn't quantifiable. It's not extractable. There's not a standardization, and it's legal. Like, how friggin' awesome is that? And I think that for those of us who are in the realm of ayahuasca, that's our biggest hope, because ayahuasca isn't being standardized and extracted. It could be, but that's not what we're working with. We're working with something more akin to cannabis as a plant, with its variables, with the set and setting, with when was it grown and when was it harvested, and how much harmala is in it, and how much DMT is in the leaf, and all of these things. So
Yeah, and I think as veterans, I always ask civilians to take the Constitution seriously and take our rights seriously, because as veterans, we were sworn to uphold the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And it's the domestic piece for me and for a lot of veterans who are the tip of the spear in the marijuana movement, that really know what it means to have these rights taken away from us, and to step up and to support those rights and speak out and come out of the closet. Definitely don't be afraid to speak your piece and stand up for what's right, because morals don't always line up with law.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, great. Well put, Ryan.
Can I just say something really quickly to Walter?
Yeah,
and his comment, for those of us working with the government in DC, gray areas are to be avoided. Peru is a safer bet. And so I just really want to acknowledge that comment and to reaffirm that absolutely Peru is the safer bet, because it's legal there. Any place something's legal is always going to be safer across the board from a standpoint of legality. Is it always going to be safer in terms of personal safety? That's up for grabs wherever you are. But I just want to acknowledge Walter, and thank you for that comment.
Yeah, thank you, Sita, for addressing that. We are about 10 minutes over time. Like I said, we're going quick, which is great. And I just want to follow up. A couple of people have asked if either of you or both would be willing to make your contact information available, or if they should contact through your respective organizations.
I am good. Should I just put on the chat, or what? How do I do that?
Yeah, that would be a great place for it.
Absolutely. So, it's not actually my personal thing, but
oh, great. Thanks for sharing your website, Ryan.
And then, also, I guess I could do that too, although it's under renovation subsequent to Amazon convergence. visionary convergence. There's been many convergences, concluding.
Oh, yeah.
And I'd just like to say that we just had, how many talks? I think it was like 48 talks and panels that were all recorded, and the recordings are being edited and they're starting to come in now. So starting in January, we'll be releasing all the talks from Visionary Convergence.
Oh, excellent.
Lots of
Thank
really
you.
great presenters, great information, lots of good education.
Wow, we're just seeing such an explosion of knowledge about this, and you both are definitely behind it. All right, well, thank you both.
Thank you so much for hosting us, man. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's been an honor to speak and learn from you both. Sita will definitely follow up about some place where we can get some of these tips and tricks out.
Yeah.
Ryan, best of luck with the institutional review board. It is absolutely possible.
Whew. Thank you.
Yeah.
We're working on it. We can do it in science. Yep.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Ryan. And I would love to talk more about this. Like, we didn't really, there's so much to talk about, but like, susto and trauma and shamanic experience of trauma and medical experience of trauma. So like, I just feel like there's so much. And Brad, thank you. It turned out to be a really good fit and a great lively conversation, and I enjoyed it. And thank everybody for, at MAPS and Evolver and Henrietta and Jeremy and everybody for like making this all happen, and all the folks out there who tuned in. It's really hopeful and inspiring.
Yeah, sure was.
Thank you guys so much. This has been great.
Yep, and we will be back next week. Well, some of us will be back next week. And Sita and Ryan, I hope you can join us as participants for that too, to monitor you and ask your questions. Next week at 5 o'clock Pacific, 8 o'clock Eastern time, I will be here with Julaine Andreas and Dr. Donna Dreyer. We'll be speaking about psychedelic therapy, especially MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for anxiety associated with life-threatening illness. So starting to talk about end-of-life issues and how spiritual experiences in psychedelic therapy may be able to help people overcome some of those anxieties. So yeah, thank you both so much, and thank you, Jeremy and Henrietta.
Thank you.
Thanks,
okay,
everyone.
so we just leave the meeting. Is that what we do, or do we?
Yes.
Okay.
I'll be ending the meeting for everybody. Good night, everyone. Thanks,
Good night,
Jeremy.
Brad,
Thanks for hosting. Are you going to be around for a minute?
I sure will.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Thank you both.
Thanks, everybody, all the listeners. Yeah.
Okay. Bye.
Good night.